Great. Well, hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar, How to Pick Your Policy, Creating a Digital Preservation Policy. I'm Biz Gallo, Statewide Digitization Initiatives Coordinator for the Library of Michigan. And my job is to help libraries and cultural heritage organizations throughout Michigan, thanks Chelsea, digitize their collections and make them accessible and preserve them over time. We had a introductory webinar series last year called the Digitization Basics webinar series, which you can view on YouTube, and I'll drop that link in the chat in a second. But this year we're getting a little bit more in depth with the How to Pick series. We're covering some more specific topics like digitizing newspapers and audiovisual material, resource-centered classes such as working with vendors or building a community archives, and then procedural classes like writing digitization grants and digitization policies like this one. As always, if there's particular topics that you're interested in, feel free to let me know so we can build content around those. But I am very excited to welcome Dr. Chelsea Denault from the Michigan Digital Preservation Network to speak today about how to create a digital preservation policy. So thank you for joining us.
Of course, Biz.
Yeah, we're going to go just over a little bit of housekeeping before I hand it over to Chelsea. Just so you know, this webinar is being recorded so that you can go back and watch it and reference it later. You'll also get a copy of the slides emailed to you. It will take about a week before the recording is available online to allow time for captioning, but you can view that on the Library of Michigan's webinar archive. There will be time for Q&A at the end. I know Chelsea has left time for that, but if you have questions throughout, feel free to drop them in the chat and we can address them either at the moment or she can address them at the end, depending on how it fits. If you have any technical issues, feel free to reach out to me or to Becky in the chat so we can help resolve those. But last, just wanted to let you know that you will receive a copy of the slides. It does have a resource section at the end. So any of these resources that Chelsea mentions today will be included in that resource document that you'll get at the end. So you can obviously follow along if you want, but know that you will get access to those. And that is all I have. So without further ado, I will hand it off to Chelsea.
Thanks so much, Biz. And welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's great to see, like I said, so many familiar names and faces on the call. So today, we will be talking about digital preservation policies. And so I thought that I would start us off with a little bit of background about what digital preservation is. I actually did an entire webinar on what digital preservation is last year for Biz's Digitization Basics series. And I really do encourage you to look through that if you haven't seen it, or if you would just like a digital preservation refresher, because my background will be very light today. And then we'll talk a little bit about why you should have a digital preservation policy. We'll walk through the policy building process, and I'll actually spend the majority of our time together walking through policy elements, providing examples, and then doing a little Mad Libs with y'all to help write those sections for your own institution. So we're going to start off with a poll. Do you have a digital preservation policy at your institution? And you have 4 options here. Yes, it works for us. Yes, but it needs some help. No, but my organization is ready to start one. And no, and we need some organizational buy-in first. So take a second to fill out the poll and we'll just see where everyone is before we get started. All right. So looking at the results here, lots of folks, 62% are in the no, but my organization is ready to start putting together a policy, which is a great place to be in coming to this webinar. So hopefully I'll provide you with enough resources to begin the process. All right. So before we start, just a little bit of background about what digital preservation is. So digital preservation is the series of managed activities necessary to ensure continued access to digital materials for as long as necessary. Ooh, that's very loud. And this comes to us from the Digital Preservation Handbook from the Digital Preservation Coalition. And so that seems like a really short definition, but there's a lot to unpack there. So first off, managed activities. This tells us that digital preservation requires a variety of actions to be done, and that we need to be proactive and systematic about how we approach those actions. And this also infers that digital preservation is an ongoing process and not a sort of like one-off, set it and forget it task. And your digital preservation policy will help you define what some of those managed activities are. Continued access. This is a reminder that the ultimate goal of digital preservation is maintaining access to and maintaining use of our digital materials. And then finally, as long as necessary, this is just a reminder that we should be aiming to preserve digital content for as long as it's needed, which will depend on your organizational use. So it might be a few years for things like bank statements or payroll records, but it also might mean in perpetuity, which is often the case for cultural memory materials. Another way to think about this definition is what we call the tripartite model of digital preservation. In this way, we see that management, technology, and content are all equally important to the process of digital preservation. We need content to preserve, and we need technology to help monitor its health, and we rely on people to manage all of the actions we take on our content. All three are equally necessary and rely upon one another to successfully protect our digital content for the long-term future. And I do want to call out the management part, the people part of digital preservation, because this is really where digital preservation policies fall, and really what we'll focus on today. So the first step, if you want to put together a new digital preservation policy or revise an old policy for your institution, is to do it with a team. And I would recommend bringing in key stakeholders who will be involved in actualizing your digital preservation policy at your organization. So some stakeholders that you might want to consider is IT staff, collections or curatorial staff, local history librarians or local history staff, donor relations staff, are actually really great to bring in when you're putting together a digital preservation policy, because they can help communicate your digital preservation standards and strategies to donors who are potentially giving content to your organization. And then finally, of course, administration. You'll want to make sure that people who have the power and the financial ability to make your digital preservation a real thing, make sure that they have some buy-in and a voice in the process as well. And all of these different stakeholders can tell you how realistic your plan is, how your preservation policy might integrate with current systems or processes, or how it doesn't, right? Which is also really useful information. And also help build consensus for your policy within their respective departments. And remember, by building a team, you allow people in your organization to feel invested in your policy planning process and to feel empowered to make it happen. Now, before you get started, these are just some useful questions to maybe bring to your digital preservation team, just to get your heads thinking about the policy making process. So first off, are there existing policies already at your organization, like a digital preservation policy, but also, right, a collections policy or a records retention policy? How will your new digital preservation policy impact other policies that you already have in place? What individuals have a stake or a role in your policy development? So you've already asked yourself this by putting together your digital preservation team, but are there other people in your organization who you should be consulting with? Is there an established protocol for policy development, review, and approval at your institution? Make sure that you know what the timeline is and if there's any forms that you need to submit to administration. Will policy development require a new working group, task force, or committee, or does one already exist? And who might need to be involved? And you already have done some of that work when you're putting together your larger digital preservation team. What is the best policy development process for your institution? How many writers should you have? Who is the best suited to write the policy? Who might have expertise to lend to the policy writing process? What is a realistic policy development timeline? And this is, I think, a very hard question and really dependent on your institution. I think it's really important to be realistic about how long your policy writing process might take, especially if a lot of the stakeholders on your digital preservation team are wearing multiple hats at your organization or are juggling multiple responsibilities. Being respectful of the capacity and time that people have on your staff to be able to contribute to the preservation policy process is really important. And then also, how will you address policy differences or stakeholder disagreements as you're going through the policy process? Because there will inevitably be some disagreement. So just making sure that you have a plan in place for working out those disagreements between different members of your team. All right, so now that we have our digital preservation team and we have these kind of bigger questions to help situate us, we will jump on into the policy process and justification. So why should you have a digital preservation policy at your organization? A digital preservation policy has two overarching purposes. The first is to define the why. Why are you doing digital preservation at your organization? And so this includes defining purpose and drivers for preserving digital records, how digital preservation enables your institution to achieve its core objectives and your mission, how digital preservation aligns with with your organization's broader strategic goals. And then, of course, communicating the benefits of long-term digital preservation. So, right, long-term access to data, and then also the economic, reputational, and cultural risks of failing to protect your content. And the second reason, to have a digital preservation policy is that it defines the authority for those undertaking digital preservation at your organization. So it articulates roles and responsibilities within your organization and to any external parties like contractors and vendors or donors, depositors of records. It defines success criteria that can be measured against. It defines the coverage of different preservation activities, including the scope of records that you're going to preserve. It will determine when and how you can appraise your digital records and your different types of appraisal practices. It should indicate standards that are being adhered to, and it should identify the owners and the actualizers of your digital preservation policy. So who is taking ownership for making sure that the policy is being implemented? So what makes a good policy versus a less good policy? I don't want to say a bad policy, because if you have a policy at all, right, you're already, I think, in a better place than many organizations. So I chose to say good versus less good. So a good policy is easy to read and understand, right? It's not going to have a ton of jargon that people across your organization who are maybe less familiar with digital preservation, it'll have language that they can understand and be able to implement. It is well researched, and I will provide many examples and research tools for you to take back with you as you go on your policy journey here. It's easy to navigate, right? Dividing up your policy into easy to visualize and easy to understand section headings can really help people figure out what section they're looking for and read your policy in a much easier way. A good policy should be mission and vision aligned to your organization. And I'll talk about this when we look at writing the purpose part of your digital preservation policy. But making sure that your mission and vision are always at the heart of why you're doing digital preservation, and making sure that that's well communicated to people within your organization so that you can have more buy-in as you go to implement it. A good policy is also tied in with other policies, right? Like a collections policy, like a records retention policy, and making sure that you're detailing the ways in which these are related to each other. A good policy is more aspirational than prescriptive. Your policy shouldn't have to change every time that you change vendor or every time that you change to a different DAM system or CMS system. And so it's rather than telling you exactly the steps that you're going to go through to do digital preservation, it's more looking towards what we aspire to be in a digital preservation program. A good policy should have buy-in from key stakeholders. And like I said earlier, building a team really helps develop that buy-in among different departments and different stakeholders in your organization by making them feel involved and empowered. And then finally, a good policy allows for feedback and review. There should always be a mechanism for this sort of reflective practice or iterative practice. Every year, every 2 years, and making sure that your team, your digital preservation team, knows that you are going to be revisiting this over time and adapting it to fit your organization's needs. So what makes a less good policy? First off, one that is too long and full of jargon, digital preservation jargon that people in your organization might not understand. A less good policy is not really drawn from best practice. It doesn't really have any sort of research behind it. A less good policy is not easily readable or navigable, right? Maybe it's just big, long paragraphs of text rather than bullet points that people can sort of get lost in. A less good policy is misaligned or maybe doesn't even draw mention of your mission and your vision of your organization. A less good policy will not relate to other policies, right? Like it just exists in the ether of your organization. It will have too many details about specific tools or solutions or strategies or vendors, which makes it really hard to adapt over time. A less good policy doesn't really have organizational buy-in, right? You sort of wrote it by yourself without getting input from other people at your organization. And so maybe they don't feel like this is really something that they should care about or that they should participate in. And then finally, that should be does not allow for feedback and review, but that's okay. You get the idea. A less good policy does not have a mechanism for feedback and review and is just a sort of static policy that doesn't change over time. So our policy development roadmap, right? This is a sort of where to start and where to end. And so we start by establishing a purpose, which I actually have a slide later on in which we'll write together a purpose for our digital preservation policy. But you should already be thinking about this even before you put words on a piece of paper or a piece of digital paper. So the first step is to establish the main purpose of your digital preservation policy and how it might integrate with your organization's mission. And think too about how your policy will be used both as a tool for advocacy and to help guide the creation and implementation of a strategy. So your strategy is going to be more focused on those particular tools or vendors or services rather than your policy. Remember, a policy is an aspirational, what you would like your digital preservation program at your organization to look like. The next step is to do some research, which is my favorite part. Spend some time investigating existing policy at your organization and understanding the needs of key stakeholders. This might mean, right, talking to people in your IT department, talking to people who work one-on-one with the public who are requesting digital records or, right, digitized local history materials. And you should incorporate research into best practice for digital preservation policy and strategies as well, to examine tools and resources, and also take some time to read policies and strategies from other organizations that are like yours. Step 3 is to identify elements and develop some structure. So, right, we want our policy to be easily navigable. So choose some helpful section headings for each section based on your research from the previous step, right? Looking at other policies. How do other organizations sort of organize their policy? And I have some suggestions later on in my presentation here. And developing a clear structure for your policy, as I mentioned, is essential to ensure that these documents are useful in practice and to make future updates easier. And your structure should also reflect any standards or existing best practice for policy documents that already exist within your organization. Step 4, develop content. So your policy content should be high level and set broad aims and objectives, right? Like I said, we want this to be aspirational. It should avoid identifying specifics like details of particular vendors and tools. More detailed information can be defined by any sort of relevant frameworks or strategy documents. And your content should be aspirational in relation to your aims and objectives, but at the same time, we shouldn't be setting unattainable goals. Making sure that we have the staff resources and the financial resources in order to make our digital preservation policy a real thing at our organization, right? Our policy might say that we want to hire a librarian that's specifically focused on digital preservation. But if you already know that your organization doesn't have the funds to be able to fund that position, right? Why would you put it in your policy? And so making sure that we're balancing aspiration with what can we actually achieve. Step 5, stakeholder review. So it's, as I said, it's essential to gain buy-in from various stakeholder groups to ensure your policy is achievable and will have support from across your organization. And you've already done this, right? By building your preservation team and who have helped you develop the content in the previous step. But the review period is also a great time to reach out to other individuals or other departments in your organization who maybe haven't been involved in the policy writing process, but you still want to get their feedback. And this is also sharing your draft documents with these stakeholder groups is a really important part of the drafting process, and you should consider any feedback that they do provide. And this can also be a key step for advocacy for digital preservation within your organization, because it allows these different stakeholders to feel engaged with the process and to understand how digital preservation activities relate to their own work. And so I really go back and forth with, right, developing content, right, actually writing the thing being the most important step. But the review process is also a really important step that I think, we're so excited that we're done writing the policy that we sort of forget to vet the policy draft with different people in our organization. So I would lean in on, I would really lean in on that section. Step 6, gain approval. So most organizations will require that new policy documents are officially approved through some formal process. Make sure that you're aware of this process within your organization and any requirements that you need to fulfill. And once approved, your policy actually carries more weight as a result. And as a result, it will be easier to implement as part of the day-to-day operations of your organization. Step 7, now you get to do the thing, right? You get to implement your digital preservation policy. This is also a great place, though, to check back in with the key stakeholders that you've been working with and ask how you can integrate the policy within their day-to-day work. And hopefully they've already sort of given you that feedback during the review process, but it's a great time just to check in with them and see how things are jiving. And then finally, update, regular reviews. Policy and strategy documents should not be static and should be responsive to changes in stakeholder needs, both external stakeholders, the public we serve, but also our internal stakeholders, right? The people in our organization. And the wider organizational context and updates to best practice will all impact your policy. And a regular review cycle should be established, but may also be triggered by significant changes in any of the areas mentioned here, right? Different stakeholders, different policy requirements, different tools or vendors. So that is our front to back roadmap here. Oops, why can't I advance my slide? Oh, there we go. So it can be very daunting to start the research process sort of from scratch. And so I just wanted to provide y'all with some research notes and resources. First off, don't reinvent the wheel, right? There are many wonderful digital preservation policies already out there, already working for organizations, already being implemented. And so, like I said in the research section, it's really helpful to read through some of these policies before starting to draft your own. And there's two enormous spreadsheets of digital preservation policies. Kaylin Smith from the National Archives in the UK and Stephen Abrams at Harvard University put together these very thorough lists of different digital preservation policies out there. And so those are what I would turn to first to find policies that really speak to me. Second, don't choose an institution that does not have a similar mission, scope, or resourcing as yours, right? So for instance, the Wisconsin Historical Society, I also include this in the resources. Another preservation policy that I point to is the Appleton Public Library Digital Preservation Policy, right? It does not serve you to look at, right, Harvard University's digital preservation policy or the University of Michigan's preservation policy. Making sure that you're not overwhelming yourself with examples that seem unattainable or unachievable. Instead, try to find organizations that are similar to yours. And that will maybe help you figure out, well, what is achievable for an organization like mine? And then finally, don't overwhelm yourself with examples. This is my problem. I want to read everyone's policy and choose what I think is the best language or the language that speaks to me the most. And as a result, I have like 50 open tabs. Don't overwhelm yourself with examples. Pick 2 to 3 that are really relevant to your institution and just draw from those. And like I said, I do point to a couple that I find are speak to public libraries and other sorts of smaller organizations, and that'll be shared at the end. All right, so now that we have our team in place, now that we have our roadmap, now that we have our our policy research done, now we're going to start writing. And so digital preservation policies can be broken up into 3 primary sections. Section 1 is the sort of rationale, right? Why, this is the why of having a digital preservation program and should draw from your organization's mission, how digital preservation relates to your mission, and the importance of digital preservation to the ongoing success of digital collections and local history archives. And so some questions that hopefully this section will address, like why are you doing this? Why do you preserve digital content? What are some of the core principles guiding your digital preservation activities? For whom are you preserving this material, right? Who are your publics? Who are your users? Who are your audience? And then how does digital preservation work fit into the larger mission of your organization? Section 2 is scope. This section should describe what a different department or program does, and should focus really on collection development strategies, audience, collaboration, the type of records you're going to preserve, right? What kinds of materials, what types of content do you preserve? And then what priorities drive the selection of materials to be preserved, right? You can't preserve everything. And so making sure that we understand how to choose what mechanisms we're going to use to choose the records that we're going to preserve. And then finally, section 3, roles and responsibilities. This should really describe who is going to be actualizing the digital preservation policy. So what are the roles and responsibilities of individual positions involved in carrying out preservation activities? And then also listing other departments or programs or positions that might work alongside you to fulfill your digital preservation activities. And so this, to me, is right, and this is just my opinion, this is a sample outline for a digital preservation policy. Including broken down into the 3 different sections here. We are going to focus on the bolded sections. So I tried to choose one from each section that we would focus on. So during the writing section of the day, and you can write along with me, or you can just sort of listen and write, fill in your Mad Libs later on. But we'll look at purpose and mandate, because I think those are the easiest, but also the most important parts of the policy. And then we'll look at scope, and then we'll skip ahead and we'll look at roles and responsibilities. And if we have time, I didn't want to overwhelm with content or with writing. If we have time, I will also point to some really great resources for principles as well. All right. So the first section we'll talk about is purpose. So what is the purpose of your digital preservation policy? Why are you committing to doing digital preservation? That's really what this section should focus on. So if you're writing along, create a statement or statements that relate to digital preservation, that relate digital preservation to your institution's mission, to your institution's needs, the communities served, and the benefits derived. And so our purpose example here comes to us from the Wisconsin Historical Society. The program, the digital preservation program, will ensure accessibility, usability, and authenticity, right? That sounds a lot like the definition that we saw on the first slide, right? Of all the permanent digital collections of this division of the Wisconsin Historical Society. The mission of the program is to ensure that the citizens of Wisconsin and other users have access to authentic and reliable electronic records and information documenting state and local governments and other digital collections. I think that this is a really wonderful purpose example, right? It sort of ties into the public, it ties into the mission of the organization, and starts to talk a little bit about the mandate as well, and even a little bit about the scope. And so if we turn this into purpose Mad Libs for your organization, right, you can see that I have a couple of brackets where you can fill in your institution. And I also have a section here at the towards the bottom in brackets where you'll fill in some information about probably from your collection policy, right? What sorts of collections, what sorts of stories do your collections tell? What location do you tell stories about, or do you have collections documenting? And so there is a little bit of work for you to do there besides just filling in your institution. And so, but otherwise, that's a pretty easy purpose to sort of put together there. Any questions so far? I can't see the chat, so I'll just
None in
skip.
the chat.
Thank you so much, Biz. I am going to pause after each section here, in case there are people who are like writing along. So, all right, moving on to mandate. So mandate is really interested in what factors are compelling your institution to establish a digital preservation policy, right? The sort of why are you doing this? And it's helpful to create a list of factors and define their reason for inclusion, right? So maybe your mandate has to do, again, with your institutional mission that you are required to fulfill. But it also might have to do with organizational commitments that you make to other organizations within your local area. And so maybe that's maybe as the public library in your local area, you have an organizational commitment to your local historical society in order to take care of their digital records or to digitize their content. That's an organizational commitment that you have made to them. And so that should also play a factor in your mandate. And then finally, any contractual or legal obligations that you have to preserving digital records, both, right, your sorts of records about your institution, right, HR records, any sort of business essential records for your institution, but also, right, you have a mandate to preserve your local history records as well. And so this is kind of a long mandate example, but I think it really touches on a lot of different ways that you can see how different policies relate to each other. And so this comes to us from the Baltimore Art Museum, which says the mandate for digital preservation at the BMA is linked to existing institutional responsibility and legal obligations. So first off, they cite their strategic plan, which is really smart, right? So many library administrators are looking to the strategic plan and making sure that, right, we're working towards the goals in our strategic plan. Tie digital preservation to it. This is a great opportunity. So first off, the strategic plan. Second point, the collections management policy, which you should definitely tie into as one of your mandates. Point three, the records retention schedule, right? This has more to do with those internal records, right? Payroll records, HR records. And then also this final bullet point, policies and procedures of the Library and Archives Department, maybe that at your institution it's called local history, including records access policy. And our Mad Libs example, right? You want to tie into your strategic plan, and there's an opportunity to also insert some language that your strategic plan might reference about long-term access to data or long-term stewardship of local history resources. So, right, take a walk through your strategic plan if you haven't done that in a while. Also making sure you're tying into your collections management policy. And if you don't have one, right, now that might be a policy that you want to tackle before taking on a digital preservation policy. Looking at your institution's records retention schedule as well. And then bullet four, right, if you have other relevant policies that you feel like really tie in to your mandate for digital preservation, drop them in right there. And then number five, this is more of a, I think, a stewardship clause, the sort that details the sort of responsibility that we as public institutions might feel towards, right, the citizen taxpayers, right, who pass our millages to keep our doors open, as well as any members or donors or any granting agencies, the responsibility we feel to those sorts of organizations to be good stewards of our collections, which digital preservation is an important part of. All right, so scope, moving on. Scope summarizes what is or what is not covered by the policy and what actions are taken in relation to those specific criteria about the content you're going to preserve. And you can start by listing the different types of digital content in your collections. And this is a great place where if you've already done a sort of inventory of your digital collections, just pull on that inventory and go through and figure out what types of digital content that you have, right? Maybe you have some AV materials. Maybe you have some oral histories. Maybe you have lots of photos or digitized newspapers or journals, right? All of these different types of content should be sort of part of your digital preservation policy and should be specified as well. So write 3 to 5 sentences describing the digital content types that require long-term preservation at your organization and what measures your institution is prepared to support. This is also a great time to consider different user groups, institutional needs, and your organization's resources that you have to care for materials. So make sure that your scope is not so large that you are unable to fulfill it, right? Again, like we've been talking about, balancing aspirational versus attainable. So a great scope example comes to us again from the Wisconsin Historical Society. The Digital Preservation Program is responsible for identifying, securing, and providing means to preserve and ensure ongoing access to digitized and born digital records of permanent value. And they list the 3 types of records that they are going to preserve in their policy: public records, private records, and publications. And if you do go to the actual policy, you'll see that they sort of describe these record groups, what's encompassed in them. But I just wanted to list them here so that the text was not like size 5. But you should be talking a little bit about the types of records that fall into these different areas. And then moving on to our scope Mad Libs. This is a great place, like I said, to go to your collecting policy or go to your collections inventory and to just insert, right, these different types of records that you have. And so this should be a relatively light lift and talking about the different file types that are part of those records and making sure that you're including everything that you have in your collections. All right, this is our last one, roles and responsibilities. So for a policy to be effective, roles and responsibilities should be defined, agreed upon, and well communicated with the people who are being described in the policy. There's nothing like looking at a policy and finding your role in there and being like, oh, I didn't know I was part of this policy, right? That's part of the whole stakeholder consultation and review. That's part of that roadmap I showed you. And these, the roles and responsibilities should also be realistic and achievable. And staff should have the appropriate skills and experience to undertake their defined roles. And this should be reflected within their job description. And, you know, I will also say, if there are skills that you need in order to fulfill your digital preservation policy that maybe your staff don't have, this is, I think, one of those borderline places where you can maybe sneak in a reference to a skill you would like your staff to have so that you can sort of advocate for it as part of your policy. And I have some resources for that as well if you are interested in those. And I have shared them at previous presentations and happy to share more broadly with the group here. And it might be helpful if you're trying to figure out, right, who you should include in your policy and maybe who you shouldn't. It's helpful sometimes to organize these roles and responsibilities using an RCAI matrix, and that stands for who is responsible for the policy, who is accountable, who is consulted, and who is informed. So responsible, these are the roles who are responsible for adhering to the policy and for the practical implementation of it into day-to-day work. Accountable, these are people who are held accountable for the success of the policy or who provide high-level oversight. So this is generally more senior roles or management groups within your organization. Consulted, so these are people or groups who provide input on issues or new processes related to digital preservation, right? So maybe your digital preservation team is one of those consulted groups. And then informed. These are people or groups who should be aware of the policy, but who don't work directly with digital content in the scope of the policy. So this might be, your library board, right? I think it's actually a great way to talk about digital preservation and digital collections to your board to say, hey, we have a digital preservation team. We just worked to write and implement this policy because this is a really important thing for our organization. And you are identified as one of our informed groups. And so here we are informing you, right? It's a great way to share that sort of information with your board and for them to maybe start being more interested in that role that you play. So roles and responsibilities example. This is from the Appleton Public Library, talking about the role of the local history librarian, as well as the role of the network services department, right? So making sure that our IT friends and colleagues are also mentioned in the roles and responsibilities section. And just our last plane of Mad Libs, right? So inserting the title of whoever is responsible for digitized collections. Maybe that is local history librarian. Maybe you have a community archivist, but making sure that that person and their role is enumerated here. And then also making sure that your IT or technology department is mentioned as well. All right. So we've reached the end here. Some key takeaways from my presentation, right? It's super important to assemble your digital preservation team. It's easier to write a policy as a team, but it's also easier to empower others to help implement your policy once it's done. And they'll provide you with useful feedback about whether or not you can actually do what you want to do. It's really helpful to determine what policies you have already in place so that you're not starting from scratch. Also, not starting from scratch, do your research. Make sure that you're drawing from other policies that relate to your other digital preservation policies from related organizations, so that you're not building the wheel from scratch, right? You are pulling from other sources, other organizations that are already doing digital preservation successfully. Outline your policy elements so that it's an easy to follow and easy to write policy. Making sure that you're securing buy-in from your different stakeholder groups at your organization. And then finally, right, implementing your policy in the day-to-day operations, but reviewing and iterating as you need to. Your policy is not a static document, and it should have a sort of life cycle to adapt to different needs of your organization. And with that, we have about 10 minutes for questions. I was a little long. Apologies, y'all.
Great. Thank you so much, Chelsea.
Ah.
That was wonderful. We have a question in the chat saying, why was support role not needed? RASIC versus RASI.
Oh, I tend to think that support is sort of included in that responsible role. But I would be interested to hear, you can include however many sort of different categories you want. But yeah, I would be interested to hear sort of maybe what support role you would be envisioning versus one of the other 4 roles that I did talk about. You can either drop it in the chat or
unmute. Either one.
Well, the normal rationale is you have one person responsible, and additional departments like your IT department, things like that would be supportive of that role.
See, it's so
as an example.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I don't know, I actually feel like digital preservation is one of those really complex tasks that makes it hard for just one person to be responsible for its day-to-day implementation. I actually do think that it's both, right, the technology and the collections person, right, the local history librarian, who are both responsible for implementing it. If you're just the local history librarian, but you don't have the sort of technical skills, right? Thinking about the tripartite model that I showed at the beginning, you need all three of those. And so your technology person is just as responsible for implementing the day-to-day policy as your local history person. But, I think this is definitely an example of maybe like tomato, tomato. But I think that's just how
Yeah,
I would,
semantics.
yeah. You can't do digital preservation without your technology person. So they are also responsible. Any other questions, y'all?
I had a question about the skill building example that you gave, where you mentioned that it might be an opportunity to build that into skill building for team members or other staff members.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I have a second here, I'll go and I'll grab a link. So the Digital Preservation Coalition, who is a wonderful resource, and I include a link in the resources at the end of the presentation to their policy toolkit as well. They have a wonderful resource called the CAT, the Competency Audit Toolkit. For those of you who are familiar with the DPC, they have a whole bunch of really wonderful digital preservation tools that all have animal names. And so they have the RAM, the Rapid Assessment Model, and they have the CAT, the Competency Audit Toolkit. And this is a really great toolkit for your digital preservation team to go through and figure out what skills your organization might need in order to achieve digital preservation, and then figuring out where the gaps are in those skills. And so you're able to use the toolkit to sort of provide quantifiable evidence to administration about what skills your organization is missing in order to achieve digital preservation. So that you can advocate for either, an additional staff member, or some additional funding for professional development, or to take a course online. So it's a really wonderful tool for that purpose. Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, it's one of my favorites, right? Because I love advocacy toolkits. So
Yeah, it's always nice to be able to point to something concrete and say,
oh yeah,
this is the reason we need this.
yeah,
And their resources.
absolutely.
Great. Well, thanks. If nobody has any other questions, I'll ask Chelsea to go to the next slide.
Sure.
And I'm speaking for Chelsea, but I'm sure she'll stay around if people have questions. We can touch base on those.
Absolutely.
I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us today, and I hope that you'll join us for our next webinar. It's coming up in June. Here's the link for registration. It's how to pick your web presence, creating and sharing digital collections. And I'm going to be joined by Richard Adler from the Michigan Service Hub of the Digital Public Library of America. Yeah, it's at the end of June, so please feel free to register. It's the second to last one in this How to Pick series. Oh, yep, I will drop that in there in just a second. Julie asked for the links to the preservation video, so I will do that. And that will be the same link for this webinar once it's done as well. Otherwise, I just wanted to thank you all for joining us today. A big thank you to Chelsea for presenting this really excellent and actionable webinar. Would you mind going to the next slide, please?
Oh yeah. So
Thank
sorry.
you. No, I just want to make sure I thank the Institute of Museum and Library Services for making this possible, and thank you all for coming. I've also included a link for this brief, it's 5-question survey that just helps us continue to improve our programming here at the Library of Michigan. So it would be great if you could fill that out. And in the meantime, I will grab those other links from the beginning of the webinar and drop them in the chat so you have them accessible. But thank you all, and happy policymaking. And since I have a few seconds and there are some of you left, I also just wanted to let you know that next month we're going to be opening up applications for a cohort model of digital collections training and education. It's an 8-month program that goes from August to April of next year that will be led by myself and co-led by other participants, maybe co-guest speakers if Chelsea wants to join or others. So that call for applications to that program or that cohort will be coming out next week. So keep an eye out for that. If that's something that you're interested in, please feel free to just reach out to me so I'm sure that you get a copy of the information. It'll be a few hours a month, an hour to an hour and a half to do the training, and then an hour a month to meet and to discuss and work on things so that we can take all of these awesome concepts that we've been talking about now for the past few years and really start to implement them at our own organizations and to do it with a community around us that can help support us, that can help guide us, answer questions, ask questions of others. So I really hope that those of you who've been following along for this journey over the last few years are interested in that cohort. And yeah, so just keep an eye out for that. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much for joining.
Thanks, everyone.
And thank
Appreciate
you.
you being here.